Something enormous just happened, and most of the people covering it are completely missing the point. Ukraine didn't just launch another drone strike. Ukraine launched the most ambitious, the most far reaching, the most strategically calculated strike operation of this entire war. And Russia, the country that has spent 3 years telling the world it would respond with overwhelming force to any escalation, essentially stood there and watched. 5 oil refineries set ablaze in a single night. A Lukoil offshore drilling platform burning in the Caspian Sea, over 900 miles from the Ukrainian border. Airfields hit. Energy depots reduced to columns of smoke that people could see from space. And then silence from Moscow. That silence is not nothing. That silence is everything. Because when you understand what that silence really means, economically, militarily, politically, psychologically, you begin to see that this war has entered a completely different phase, and the world that comes out the other side of it is not going to look anything like the world we thought we were living in. Let's slow down and actually think about what we're looking at here, because this deserves real honest analysis and not the breathless headline treatment that comes and goes within 24 hours and leaves you no wiser than before you clicked. Ukraine has been building toward this moment for the better part of 2 years. What started as occasional drone raids on border facilities gradually, methodically, and with extraordinary patience evolved into something far more dangerous for the Kremlin, a systematic campaign to dismantle the financial engine of Russia's war machine. And that engine runs on oil. Russia's entire ability to sustain this conflict, to pay its soldiers, to buy North Korean ammunition, to keep its population economically pacified enough to avoid mass unrest, all of it flows directly from oil and gas export revenues. So when Ukraine began hitting refineries in early 2024, it wasn't being reckless. It was being precise. It was identifying the single most important vulnerability in Russia's war-sustaining infrastructure and tapping it over and over again with increasing confidence and increasing reach. By early 2025, analysts at Reuters calculated that Ukrainian drone attacks had already disabled roughly 10% of Russia's total refining capacity. 10% sounds modest until you understand that Russia's domestic fuel market runs on extremely thin margins of surplus. The moment that buffer disappears, you get gas lines, you get fuel shortages in regions hundreds of miles from the front. You get ordinary Russian citizens, people who have been successfully insulated from the costs of this war by a government that has worked hard to project normalcy, suddenly experiencing the war in a very direct, very personal, very inconvenient way. And that is exactly what happened. Videos circulated across Russian social media showing lines stretching around city blocks at gas stations in multiple Russian regions. The Russian government, scrambling to contain the optics, moved to ban gasoline exports entirely until the end of the year. Putin himself signed emergency legislation allowing Russian companies to refine oil in Belarus and then import it back across the border just to stabilize the domestic market. These are not the actions of a country that is comfortably absorbing the pressure. These are the actions of a country that is quietly, carefully trying to manage a situation that is becoming increasingly difficult to manage quietly or carefully. And then came the December strikes. 5 refineries in a single night, an offshore Lukoil platform in the Caspian Sea, hit by Ukrainian long-range Ludi drones, aircraft produced entirely in Ukraine, designed entirely in Ukraine, carrying warheads weighing up to 350 kilograms and capable of flying over 900 miles to reach their target. This wasn't a lucky hit. This wasn't improvisation. This was the product of months, possibly years, of intelligence gathering, route planning, electronic warfare preparation, and sheer engineering innovation by a country that, remember, the mainstream narrative was describing as being on the edge of collapse just 12 months earlier. Ukraine's drones flew unimpeded through Russian airspace for hundreds of miles. They reached targets deep in the Samara region, the Krasnodar region, the Saratov region, the Volgograd region. About one-fifth of them flew directly over Moscow, circling the capital and triggering the city's first full air raid shelter warning in a very long time, forcing the closure of all 4 of Moscow's major airports and stranding thousands of travelers through the night. And Russia's air defense, the system Putin has spent years parading before the world as an impenetrable shield, couldn't stop it. Now, the Kremlin's official response was predictable. Russia's Ministry of Defense released a statement claiming its forces had shot down 287 Ukrainian drones and missiles, and that damage at all locations was minimal. But here is where you have to start reading the situation rather than just reading the press release. Because Russian social media, coming from ordinary citizens in the very cities being targeted, posted in real time with photos and videos, told a completely different story. People in these cities described Ukrainian weapons flying over their neighborhoods largely unopposed. They described the explosions, they described the fires, and they described a level of fear and shock that you simply do not see in populations that have just been told their air defenses worked perfectly. Independent Russian media outlets, including Astra and the Moscow Times, confirmed the scale of the strikes. Even Vladimir Solovyev, perhaps the most zealously pro-Kremlin propagandist in Russia's entire media landscape, went on national television and admitted it. He was mid-broadcast when word came in of yet another Ukrainian strike on the Tuapse oil refinery, and something cracked. For us, here there is a war going on, he said, visibly agitated. We are being hit everywhere. That line did not come from a Ukrainian press release. That came from inside the Kremlin's own media ecosystem, broadcast to millions of Russians who had been carefully shielded from exactly that kind of admission for 3 years. Something had shifted, and the people whose entire job is to manage perceptions couldn't fully contain it anymore. The Tuapse situation is worth dwelling on because it illustrates, in almost poetic detail, how this dynamic has been playing out. Tuapse is a city on the Black Sea, part of Russia's storied resort coastline, the so-called Russian Riviera near Sochi. It is home to a Rosneft oil refinery and a critical export terminal through which practically all Russian crude oil destined for Black Sea markets passes. Ukraine hit it in April of last year, then again, then again. By late April of this year, the refinery had been struck multiple times in just 12 days. Fires burned for a week. Toxic black soot rained down on residential neighborhoods. Oil seeped into the groundwater. Local residents posted videos of animals suffering and cars covered in a black oily film. The city was choking, and for nearly 2 weeks, the Kremlin said essentially nothing. It took 3 strikes in quick succession, and then the fires becoming visible from space, before Putin finally dispatched his emergencies minister to the scene. His message: the situation is not easy, but it's controllable. The environmental experts on the ground described it as a regional ecological catastrophe, the worst in years. That gap between official reassurance and on-the-ground reality has become one of the defining features of how Russia is now experiencing this war. And this brings us to the strategic question that really matters. Why hasn't Russia retaliated in kind? Russia has, throughout this war, demonstrated an extraordinary willingness to strike Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. It has attacked hospitals, apartment buildings, power stations, thermal plants, heating systems in the dead of winter. It has fired ballistic missiles at residential neighborhoods. It used 298 drones and 69 missiles in a single night against Ukrainian cities in May of last year, what Ukraine's military described as the largest single aerial assault since the full-scale invasion began. So it is not that Russia lacks the capability or the will to hit hard. The question is why, when Ukraine begins systematically dismantling Russia's energy export capacity from the inside out, Russia's response has been so conspicuously inadequate on the strategic level. Russia has not found a way to stop the drone campaign. It has not developed a military answer to Ukraine's growing long-range strike capability. It has largely retreated to propaganda, claiming its air defenses are working while its own citizens post video evidence that they are not. And it has found itself in the extraordinarily uncomfortable position of watching its domestic propaganda machine, which depends entirely on the illusion of Russian invulnerability, crack in real time on national television. The economic dimension of this cannot be overstated when we're talking about geopolitical shifts and power structures, which is really what this conversation is about. Russia's central bank has been forced to keep interest rates at historically high levels, approaching 21% at various points, to try to contain inflation that is running away from them. According to the Levada Center, Russia's most respected independent polling organization, price growth has been the single biggest concern for ordinary Russians since the war began, and by mid-2025, nearly 60% of respondents named it the country's most acute problem. Russia is burning through its reserve funds at a rate that outside observers have begun calling unsustainable. Sweden's military intelligence chief publicly described Russia as living on borrowed time. There is a looming fiscal crisis underneath all the official triumphalism, and it is being accelerated by every refinery that Ukraine manages to put offline, every export terminal that gets hit, every pipeline that gets disrupted. Ukraine has effectively opened a second front in this war, not on the ground, but in Russia's economic bloodstream. What this also tells us about the broader geopolitical landscape is that the narrative of Russian invulnerability, which was always more mythology than reality, but which served a specific political purpose both inside Russia and internationally, is fracturing. For years, the operating assumption in Western capitals and in many American policy circles was that Russia was an adversary of nearly unlimited military depth, whose capacity for punishment was essentially unbounded, and whose will to escalate was unshakable. That assumption drove enormous amounts of Western caution, the refusal to provide Ukraine with certain weapons, the endless debates about red lines, the fear that any meaningful escalation would trigger an uncontrollable Russian response. And here's what the current situation reveals. Russia's escalatory capacity, while real, is more constrained than the mythology suggested. Russia is fighting a war of attrition with a military that has lost, by serious Western estimates, over 1 million total casualties, including more than 250,000 killed. It is supplementing its manpower with North Korean troops. Its defense industrial base is strained. Its air defense network, designed for a different kind of threat, is struggling to cope with swarms of cheap indigenous Ukrainian drones coming from unexpected directions. Russia has been making incremental territorial gains in eastern Ukraine, but at costs that military analysts are describing as Pyrrhic. The capture of Pokrovsk, for instance, came after Russia sacrificed the equivalent of 5 divisions of armored vehicles and an estimated 25,000 troops just for that one city. Meanwhile, Ukraine's domestic defense industry has been quietly transforming. Zelensky announced plans to manufacture 30,000 long-range drones and 3,000 missiles in a single year. The Lyuty drone that hit the Caspian Sea platform was built in Ukraine by Ukrainians without American or European components that could be withheld or restricted by nervous Western governments. Ukraine has been developing what its officials call long-range sanctions, not paper sanctions processed in Brussels or Washington, but physical, kinetic sanctions delivered by drone directly to the infrastructure that generates Russian war revenue. Every refinery offline is a sanction. Every export terminal on fire is a sanction. Every pipeline disrupted is a sanction. And unlike the diplomatic variety, these cannot be watered down by lobbying, cannot be circumvented through shadow fleets, cannot be negotiated away by countries that still want cheap Russian energy. They simply burn. What does this mean for the United States and for Americans who are trying to understand where the world is heading? It means that the global power balance is being renegotiated, not in summit rooms and not through the kind of geopolitical theater that dominates cable news, but in the night sky over Russian refineries and in the economic data coming out of Moscow. It means that a country many people had written off as too small, too poor, and too outgunned to actually change the trajectory of this conflict has found a way to impose costs on a nuclear power that the nuclear power cannot easily absorb and cannot easily retaliate against without further exposing the limits of its own capability. It means that the war economy that Putin spent years building, the one designed to make Russia sanction-proof and Western pressure-proof, has a vulnerability that sits in plain sight, processing crude oil into export revenue, and that vulnerability is now being exploited with increasing precision and increasing scale. The peace negotiations that have been grinding away through Istanbul, Geneva, Riyadh, and Anchorage have so far produced a prisoner exchange and a great deal of paper. Russia continues to insist on its maximalist demands, effectively the extinguishment of Ukrainian sovereignty in exchange for a ceasefire. Ukraine and Europe have put forward counter-proposals. The Trump administration, which came in promising to end the war in 24 hours, has found that reality is considerably more complicated than that promise suggested. Putin has no meaningful incentive to stop while his ground forces are making incremental gains and while he believes Western resolve will eventually crack. But the drone campaign is changing that calculus in ways that diplomacy alone could never achieve. Russia's war approval numbers remain officially stable, around 70%, but the same polling shows growing exhaustion, with 66% of Russians now saying they favor peace talks, the highest number ever recorded. And crucially, even among those who favor talks, the conditions have shifted. They want negotiations, but on terms that don't amount to total humiliation. That is a population that is beginning to feel the weight of this war in a way it didn't 3 years ago, and the fires in Tuaps and the lines at gas stations and the black soot raining down on resort towns have everything to do with that shift. This is what strategic asymmetry actually looks like when it works. Not a single dramatic battle, not a cinematic counteroffensive, but a methodical, patient, relentlessly intelligent campaign to find the pressure points that matter most and apply force to them with whatever tools you have available until the system on the other side begins to show its cracks. Ukraine has found those pressure points. Russia, for all its nuclear arsenal and all its bluster and all its propaganda infrastructure, has not found an adequate answer. And that silence, that conspicuous, telling silence after Ukraine's biggest strike yet, is the sound of a giant realizing that the rules of this game have changed in ways it did not prepare for.